Imagine a chessboard where the pieces have been moving for over 1,000 years. Every move, every alliance, every betrayal reshapes not just borders, but identities. Now picture one of those central pieces being suddenly attacked, and the shockwave of this move doesn't stay on the board. It travels continents and reaches your life in your gas prices, your electricity bill, the cost of your groceries. That's what happens when Russia invades Ukraine. This is not just another distant war in the headlines. It's the story of two peoples with shared roots, clashing identities, and a conflict that has become a structural problem for the global economy. But how did we get here? How did a region that once looked like just another Soviet bloc part become the epicenter of a crisis reshaping energy, food, and the cost of living? In this video, we're going to peel this story back layer by layer. First, the historical roots of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Then, the geopolitical interests that turned long-term tension into full-scale war. And finally, the economic impacts that make this conflict show up in your life. To understand the present, we have to go back before 2022 and 2014. The story of Russia and Ukraine begins 1,000 years ago, from common past, and two paths that slowly drift apart. To see how those paths diverge, we go back to 9th century Kievan Rus, a loose federation of Slavic tribes around Kyiv, in lands shared by Ukraine and Russia. For both nations, Kievan Rus is seen as a mother civilization, a shared cultural cradle. In the late 10th century, something crucial happens: the Christianization of Kievan Rus. The region adopts Eastern Christianity and aligns itself with the Orthodox tradition. Over time, this choice becomes central to the identity of Russians and Ukrainians. But that early sense of unity was fragile. In the 13th century, Mongol invasions shattered Kievan Rus into smaller competing powers. From then on, the lands that become Russia and Ukraine follow different trajectories. To the northeast, the Principality of Moscow grows in strength. Over the centuries, Moscow becomes the core of what we know as the Russian Empire. Ukraine, whose name can be translated as borderland, lives a different story. For centuries, its lands are contested and ruled by powers like Poland and Lithuania. At times, the Ottoman Empire also projects influence and control over Ukrainian territory. But this long experience under foreign rule does not erase Ukrainian identity. It helps forge a distinct sense of being Ukrainian, rooted in struggles for autonomy. And in recurring resistance against domination, that identity becomes even more defined. Even so, large parts of Ukraine are absorbed into the Russian Empire, especially from the 17th century onward. This process includes cooperation, but also heavy cultural repression and attempts to dilute Ukrainian identity. The 20th century brings a dramatic new chapter for Ukraine. After the 1917 Russian Revolution, Ukraine briefly declares independence. That window closes quickly. In 1922, Ukraine becomes a founding Soviet republic. Under Soviet rule, Ukraine experiences a deep paradox. On one side, there is rapid industrialization and integration into a major power. On the other, Ukraine faces tragedies like the Holodomor, the famine of 1932-1933. Many Ukrainians see the Holodomor as a deliberate act of genocide. Then comes World War II, and Ukraine becomes a brutal battlefield. Millions die, and nationalist movements rise to fight Soviet domination. In that struggle, some enter controversial tactical alliances with Nazi Germany. It's a complex, painful chapter whose memory still fuels political disputes today. Meanwhile, another piece of the puzzle is taking shape: Crimea. This peninsula in the Black Sea has enormous strategic value. It's annexed by the Russian Empire in the 18th century. Later, in 1954, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev gifts Crimea to Ukraine. At the time, it seemed like a purely internal Soviet administrative decision. No one imagined this transfer would later become a major point of contention. It turns into one of the most explosive disputes between Russia and independent Ukraine. When the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, Ukraine becomes a fully independent state. In Moscow, many leaders never truly accept this separation as final. Ukraine is seen not as fully sovereign, but as part of Russia's natural sphere of influence, a space that, in Russian eyes, should remain aligned with Moscow's interests. On this historical ground, the seeds of the current conflict are planted. Shared origins, diverging identities, and imperial expansions all feed today's tensions. So do trauma under Soviet rule and unresolved disputes over territory and sovereignty. After independence in 1991, Ukraine finally had its own state. But independence did not erase the past or the country's internal divisions. Ukraine was split between a future-looking West and a strong pull from Russia. In the East and South, many speak Russian and have long-standing ties to Moscow. In the 2000s, that tension became visible on the streets. Across the former Soviet space, color revolutions challenged pro-Russian governments. Ukraine had its own in 2004, the Orange Revolution. Massive protests against election fraud forced a new vote and a more pro-Western leadership. For Vladimir Putin in Moscow, these movements weren't just local uprisings. They looked like Western-backed revolutions happening right on his doorstep. Things escalated again in 2014. Ukraine's pro-Moscow president, Viktor Yanukovych, suddenly backed away from a EU deal. Protests exploded in Kyiv. The Euromaidan movement filled the streets and squares. After months of confrontation and bloodshed, Yanukovych fled the country. Russia answered with force. It annexed Crimea and backed separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine. A low-intensity war began. Trenches, shelling, and almost no progress on the map. That war would drag on for 8 years. It was the first clear sign. Putin would use military power to keep Ukraine in Russia's orbit. On February 24, 2022, there was no more ambiguity. Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Putin called it a special military operation to denazify Ukraine and protect Russian speakers. He also justified it as a way to stop NATO's eastward expansion. On the ground, the operation looked very different. Missiles hit cities, tanks crossed the border, and a country fought for survival. President Volodymyr Zelensky refused to flee and became the face of resistance. What was supposed to be a quick victory turned into a long, grinding war of attrition. We can think of this war in phases. Phase 1. The failed blitzkrieg, from February to April 2022. Russia tried to capture Kyiv quickly, topple the government, and install a friendly regime. Ukrainian resistance, poor logistics, and Western intelligence combined to stop that plan. Russian forces pulled back from northern Ukraine, a major setback for the Kremlin. Phase 2. The battle for Donbas and the south, from mid-2022 to early 2023. After failing near Kyiv, Russia shifted focus east and south, toward a corridor to Crimea. Ukraine, with growing Western support, launched surprise counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson. Russia's partial mobilization in late 2022 showed the operation had become a long war. It sparked protests and a wave of people leaving the country. Phase 3. Trench warfare and stalemate, from 2023 to mid-2024. The front lines hardened and the conflict became a World War I-style battlefield. The fight for Bakhmut, with heavy losses on both sides, symbolized this brutal phase. Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive made gains, but not the decisive breakthrough many hoped for. Strong Russian fortifications and vast minefields slowed and blunted Ukraine's advance. Phase 4. High-tech attrition from mid-2024 to today. The war is now a test of technology, endurance, and willpower. Ukraine has ramped up FPV drones and long-range strikes inside Russia. They hit oil refineries, air bases, and other key infrastructure. This doesn't just damage equipment, it sends a message across Russian territory. Russia keeps pushing slowly in the east, seeking small but symbolically important gains. On paper, the main actors in this war are clear. Russia, a nuclear power, tries to reassert its historical sphere of influence. Ukraine is fighting for its survival as a sovereign state. Behind Ukraine stands a Western coalition: the US, European countries, and NATO. In practice, this is more than a war between two countries. It's a clash between two models of security and world order. One model is based on spheres of influence and hard power. The other, at least in theory, defends the sovereignty of smaller states, as long as those states are on the right side of the map. While this plays out on the battlefield, its impact reaches far beyond Ukraine's borders. One of the first shockwaves hit global energy markets. Russia is one of the world's largest exporters of oil and natural gas. War and sanctions disrupted those flows, pushing energy prices higher. For many people, the war appeared as more expensive gas and electricity bills. It also meant a generally higher cost of living. At the same time, a second crisis emerged: food security. Russia and Ukraine are major exporters of wheat, corn, and fertilizers. Blocked Black Sea ports and export problems created shocks in global food markets. Bread, pasta, and cooking oil became more expensive in many importing countries, especially in regions that depend heavily on grain imports. The war turned basic goods, fuel, wheat, fertilizer, into geopolitical weapons. Beyond prices, the war triggered broader economic turbulence. Sanctions designed to weaken Russia's war machine also hit global supply chains. Inflation rose, investment became riskier, and many companies left the Russian market. That withdrawal meant job losses and significant sunk costs. And then there is the human cost of this war. Millions of Ukrainians have fled their homes. Cities were bombed, hospitals and schools destroyed, entire communities displaced. Europe has seen one of the largest refugee movements since World War II. Inside Russia, the war carries its own price. High casualties, partial mobilization, and long-term sanctions strain society and the economy. The Wagner Group's attempted mutiny in 2023 exposed cracks in the Russian elite. It raised questions about how stable Putin's control really is. For Ukraine, the challenge looks different. It must keep resisting on the battlefield while relying on Western aid. That aid might not last forever. Reconstruction will require billions of dollars and many years of effort. All of that while the war is still ongoing. For the West, there is a constant dilemma. How far can support go without risking direct confrontation with Russia? Weapons and sanctions help Ukraine, but they have economic and political costs at home. Looking ahead, several scenarios are possible, and none of them are easy. The war could drag on as a long, grinding conflict with small gains and losses. There could be a negotiated end driven by military, economic, or political exhaustion. Or, in the worst case, there could be escalation and a wider confrontation. What's clear is that this war is not an isolated event. It is the visible tip of a much longer historical story. A story of shared origins, broken empires, and competing identities, and of a struggle for influence that extends far beyond Ukraine's borders. At the beginning of this video, we imagined a 1,000-year-old chessboard. Now we can see what that metaphor really means. Every move, from Kievan Rus's to the Soviet Union and independence in 1991, to the invasion in 2022, has reshaped borders and people's lives, including yours. The war between Russia and Ukraine is not just about territory on a map. It is the result of centuries of shared history, identity struggles, and power politics. Today, it shows up in energy prices, food costs, and global security debates. In future episodes, we can go deeper into some of these pieces on the board. For example, the origins of NATO and why its expansion is a red line for Russia, or how the war reshapes global food security, especially in Africa and the Middle East, or how countries like Belarus became key pawns in Putin's strategy. Tell us in the comments which direction you'd like to see next. If you like this kind of historical deep dive, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. We'll see you in the next video on another journey through history shaping our world.